Good morning, everyone, and thank you, first of all, to InterTradeIreland for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to start by just pointing out that I have a cold, so my apologies if my voice is a wee bit muffled. And also my apologies if I mid-sentence mute myself because I've had to cough or anything like that. So my apologies in advance for that. Okay, so as John has outlined, this session will run for around 60 minutes, and then it will be followed by a dedicated Q&A session. So as John said, please do add any questions to the chat function as we go along, and hopefully we'll get a chance to come back to a few of them at the end. I hope to move reasonably briskly through the early context so we can spend proper time on areas that tend to cause the most confusion and cost for businesses in practice. So we've got 30 odd slides today. Some of them I will be moving through pretty quickly, and some of them I will take a little bit more time to go through and provide a bit more context and maybe even some examples that I've come across in my own working day-to-day life. John is going to be, moving on for me on the slides as we go along here as well. So hopefully I'll remember to tell him to do that. So John, if we move on to the next slide. So quick disclaimer before we start. The Windsor Framework and related guidance continues to evolve, and different elements get implemented in stages. And whilst everything I'm covering today is accurate at the time of presenting, it's important to recognise that individual circumstances matter. The session is designed to give clarity and context and is not tailored for advice for a specific transaction. So please be aware of that. If you do need professional advice bespoke to your business, go and seek that. And at the end of the presentation today, I know that John or Christine, somebody from InterTradeIreland, will be talking about the different supports that they have available. So John, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So today's agenda, this is a journey we're going to take today. We're going to start with a brief recap of the Windsor Framework and Northern Ireland's position, then move into how trade on the island of Ireland works in practice. From there, we're going to spend a good chunk of time on at-risk versus not at risk. These and the levers available to manage cost and compliance when goods are at risk. Before finishing with high-level overview on ICS2 and SPS movement requirements. So plenty to cover, but all obviously connected. So if we move on again, John. This is an important slide because it sets the boundaries. Today is about trade in goods under the Windsor Framework. How it works in reality for Northern Ireland businesses trading with Ireland, the EU, Great Britain and the rest of the world. We are not covering services trade, and we are not dealing with GB to EU trade outside the Windsor Framework, and we're not entering into any political debate on the rights and wrongs of the arrangements that are in place for us. Keeping that distinction clear hopefully will avoid a lot of cross wires or any cross wires later. So if we move on again, John, to the next one, please. This is very deliberately brief, but I think it's always very important to give an anchor, a starting point when we look at post-Brexit trade. We can't really consider post-Brexit trade without, first of all, considering pre-Brexit trade. So pre-Brexit, the UK sat inside the EU customs union and single market. Goods moved freely. There was no customs declarations, no tariffs, and the UK was broadly aligned on VAT and regulatory rules with the other 27 member states, including Ireland. I start here because many assumptions businesses still hold are rooted in this model and what it was like to trade pre-Brexit, even though this no longer exists. Okay, John, again, if we move on, please. So how has trade changed
Hello?
since? Hello, John, can you hear me? Yeah, is everything okay?
Yeah, everything's fine, Jonathan. Yeah, we're just putting people on mute. Thanks.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so how has trade changed since January 1st, 2021? So from 2021 onwards, the baseline has changed. The UK left the EU customs union and single market, and that includes Northern Ireland. The UK as a whole exited the EU customs union and single market. Great Britain is now treated by the EU as a third country in terms of trade, albeit that it has the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement in place. It is no longer part of the EU customs union and single market. Northern Ireland, however, did not follow the same path, which brings us to its unique position. Again, John, we move on to the next one, please. So Northern Ireland sits, as I say, in a genuinely unique place. It remains part of the UK customs territory, whilst also staying aligned with EU rules for goods. That means that the combination underpins our unfettered access to both GB, the internal United Kingdom market, and continued access to the European Union single market for goods. This is where the complexity exists, but also opportunity. Again, John, if we move on to the next slide, please. Dual market access is often referenced, but not always well understood when we're talking about Northern Ireland. We often think about dual market access in terms of goods moving into Northern Ireland. But in simple terms, it's the ability for Northern Ireland businesses to sell goods that are in free circulation in Northern Ireland into both Great Britain and the European Union without routine tariffs or customs barriers being applied. It's important to stress two things. Dual market access applies to goods, not services, and it is genuinely unique globally. Thank you, John, if you move on again for me. So let's have a look at this slide. Maybe, yeah, John, yeah, you can take it, yeah, put them all up there. Thank you, John. Appreciate that. So this slide puts some structure on that idea. So what has changed, as I say, since the 1st of January 2021? And, you know, it didn't all come in essentially on the 1st of January 2021. Some elements have been phased in over time. But in terms of trade between Northern Ireland and Ireland, it is essentially frictionless for goods. It remains very much like it was pre-Brexit. Northern Ireland to GB is unfettered for qualifying goods. So you'll hear this term, qualifying Northern Ireland goods, QNIG, and we're going to talk about it during these slides today. Unfettered for qualifying Northern Ireland goods. There is a small number of prohibited and restricted goods. I think it's about a dozen. Atlantic toothfish, tuna fish, mercury goods, torture goods. There's a small number of prohibited and restricted goods that require export declarations when moving from NI to GB. But in the main, it is unfettered for qualifying Northern Ireland goods. Where complexity does start to come in, and has come in, is with regards to GB to NI, and goods entering NI from the rest of the world when we think about at-risk and not at-risk status. But what we have for GB to NI movements is we now have a requirement for import declarations and import safety and security declarations that did not exist pre-January 1st, 2021. And that's obviously the area we're going to focus on today as part of this webinar. If you move on again for me, John. Qualifying Northern Ireland goods. Trading goods between Northern Ireland and Ireland continues to operate much as it did before Brexit, as I've already said. There's no customs declarations, no tariffs, no SPS checks, and the same regulatory regime for goods applies. That frictionless trade is not accidental. It's protected by the rules that we are now about to discuss. When it comes to movement of goods from Northern Ireland to Great Britain and the dual market access, qualifying Northern Ireland goods are goods deemed to have been either in free circulation in Northern Ireland at the point of sale. This is key, at the point of sale.
It's a kind of like.
Sorry, guys, can you mute, please?
Maybe a wee mute button somewhere, like it's mute. There's like beside it, there's like a wee mute button maybe.
Ah, yeah, that hit the mute button and I've unmuted, but.
All right, folks.
Oh, just one second, Jonathan. I'll mute people now.
I am muted. Oh.
Okay, qualifying Northern Ireland goods are, as I said, goods that are in free circulation in Northern Ireland at the point of sale. That means that they have to be physically located in Northern Ireland at the point of sale. And manufactured goods that have been manufactured, processed using materials that were in free circulation in Northern Ireland at the point of sale. So it's key when we look at unfettered access to GB from NI. And this is going to be very relevant when we look at the All-Ireland supply chain. And I have no doubt I'm going to have questions about this later on today. Okay, we move on to the next one. VAT often causes confusion. So this slide is about reassurance for companies when it comes to VAT between Northern Ireland and the EU. Whilst Northern Ireland remains part of the UK's VAT system, for goods, it also follows EU VAT rules. This means that NI to IE or NI to EU or IE EU to NI movements are treated as intra-community supplies for VAT purposes. Importantly, import VAT does not arise on NI to IE goods movements when it does arise for GB to IE or IE to GB movements. Services follow the UK VAT rules for third countries, which are different again. Okay, John, we can move on to the next slide, please. At risk is a central concept of the Windsor Framework. Its purpose is to protect the integrity of the EU single market, whilst allowing frictionless trade on the island of Ireland. Whether goods are at risk determines duty liability, customs processes, and, where applicable, sanitary, phytosanitary, SPS requirements. Again, John, if you want to move on. This is a key moment in this presentation. Goods entering Northern Ireland from Great Britain or the rest of the world are at risk by default. This is a huge misconception. People assume that their goods are not at risk, when the reality is the default position is that their goods are at risk. Not at risk should not be assumed. It must be demonstrated based on intended destination and what happens to the goods next. Many issues arise because this default position isn't understood by companies. It's also additionally confused because someone will say to me, I only trade with other businesses in Northern Ireland. But the reality of it is when you trade B2B in Northern Ireland, you do not know where your goods go to. You are not responsible for the final destination of your goods. So that adds additional evidence requirements on companies, and we're going to talk about things like that. So again, John, if you move on to the next slide for me. Declaring goods is not at risk. Not at risk goods are those goods that are intended to remain in Northern Ireland or the wider United Kingdom. These movements sit under the UK Internal Market Scheme and benefit from reduced data and no EU duty. Authorisation, intention and evidence all matter here when it comes to not at risk goods. This is often comes up and people will talk to me about, well, our goods are not at risk for one reason or another. HMRC Trader Support Service a couple of years ago provided me with the best definition that I have had and seen since when it came to at risk and not at risk. In order to be able to declare your goods as not at risk, you must know at the point of import the final destination of 100% of the goods that you're bringing in, and that those goods will remain within either Northern Ireland or the United Kingdom. Now, for some exemptions for commercial processors, for example, construction, it is Northern Ireland specific rather than the United Kingdom. But in the main, it's the United Kingdom. You must know that the goods are not at risk of entering the EU. 100% of the goods. If you make your goods available for sale within the EU, if you make your goods available for sale and you sell 1% or 99% of your goods within the European Union single market, and you do not know at the point of import the final destination of the 100%, the full amount of those goods, they are deemed to be at risk. We move on to the next one, please. So, as I said, I just briefly mentioned there, processing is where many businesses come unstuck. Again, I don't believe this is a case of companies trying to, work around or circumvent or anything like that. But I've heard a number of times this similar analogy. We bring in materials, we process those materials into a final product which is worth X numbers of times the value of the materials that we bring in. We do not sell those materials that we bring in. We only sell the finished product. Therefore, the goods that we bring in from GB and the rest of the world are not at risk. Those goods are automatically at risk. If goods are altered, transformed, or incorporated into another product in Northern Ireland, they are usually treated at risk, and that is under the Ireland-Northern Ireland Protocol, Article 5 of the protocol. There are limited exemptions, but eligibility is narrower than many expect. This is one, again, that I think we're going to find questions and get some questions about later on. But if you commercially process material, if you bring materials in for commercially processing in Northern Ireland, if you are a manufacturer commercial processor, assume that your goods are at risk, and then we can investigate the opportunities that exist thereafter with regards to them potentially meeting not at risk exemptions or turnover thresholds. Again, if we move on to the next slide, please, John. Okay, so when it comes to commercial processors, and I said there's a couple of exemptions. Now, in the first case, we have eligibility criteria for UKIMS, UK Internal Market Scheme. The UK Internal Market Scheme in June 2023 replaced the previous UK Trader Scheme. UK Internal Market Scheme was negotiated as part of the Windsor Framework arrangements of February 2023, and it had some changes from the original UK Trader Scheme. One change was there had been a turnover threshold of 500,000 for commercial processors under the UK Trader Scheme, and that threshold was increased to 2 million under the new UK Internal Market Scheme. But you still must meet all other eligibility criteria. It's not a case of if your turnover as a commercial processor was under 500k and is now under 2 million k, you can register for UKIMS and you can bring your goods in, materials in as not at risk, and then sell into the EU and elsewhere. The same criteria applies in the first instance for all companies, applies for commercial processors, i.e., in order to be able to declare goods as not at risk, you must know at the point of import that 100% of the goods that you are bringing in will remain within either Northern Ireland or the United Kingdom, and you will hold evidence for 5 years to back that up. So the threshold was changed to 2 million, and there is also some exemptions for businesses that operate in specified exempt sectors. One that I mentioned is construction, where the materials that you bring in will form a permanent structure within Northern Ireland. It is not within the United Kingdom, it is within Northern Ireland, and that applies to you and one further entity. The other exemptions are for SPS goods brought in for consumer consumption. If you bring in, ingredients such as pepperoni and pineapple and cheese, and it'll go on to a pizza or something like that. But there's also one for if you operate as a charitable organization, as a manufacturer, and you manufacture products that are then not sold but provided free of charge to users. There's animal feed that is brought in, used by yourself and one further entity. I think I've covered them all out there. We move on to the next one, please. Okay. At-risk goods are those goods that are either destined at the point of movement for the EU, or they're at genuine risk of moving onward into the EU for the reasons that I gave earlier, i.e. you sell on an all-Ireland basis or whatever. At-risk goods are subject to full customs formalities, and EU tariffs may apply. You need to look at this not as a penalty, but a mechanism that makes frictionless Northern Ireland trade possible. If we didn't have the controls on goods moving in from GB into NI, those controls would have to take place on the land border at the 250 to 350 border crossing points on the island of Ireland instead. So without effective at-risk controls, frictionless Northern Ireland trade could not exist. These rules underpin trust in the Windsor Framework and the Northern Ireland Protocol, Northern Ireland Protocol, and compliance shouldn't be seen as a barrier, but it's what enables us with access, continued access to the European Union single market for goods. If you move on again for me, John, please. In addition to goods that are at risk because of where they are sold or where they're going to be sold, I need to introduce as well a really important concept, because this one catches people out. Some goods are not just at risk by default. They are automatically at risk, and you cannot disapply it even if you're UKIMS certified, and even if you only sell to customers in Northern Ireland or the United Kingdom. If you have a store in Northern Ireland that only physically sells from that bricks and mortar store, and you only have customers that come in through the doors and purchase from you, buy off you, pay in sterling, pay the VAT that you apply on the goods and everything else, there's still some goods that are automatically at risk and you cannot disapply it. This is where EU safeguarding measures apply, such as tariff rate quotas on steel. This is where the EU and the UK have done it as well. Coincidentally, the tariff rate quotas were introduced during President Trump's first time in office in the United States. This is where an agreed amount of tonnage of certain commodities can be brought in at a 0% tariff, and thereafter, when that quota has been filled, a 25% tariff applies, and you must quote the quota at the point of movement. Where anti-dumping or countervailing duties apply, for example, one of the ones I dealt with a lot last year was around multi-layered wooden flooring coming in from China, which had initially, around January last year, a provisional duty rate applied on it. That meant that it was an investigation stage and there's a provisional duty applied where they would take a deposit from you, and then that would either be refunded or set against any duty when it became definitive. And it did become definitive then at a lower rate, dare I say, but at a rate. But this anti-dumping duty was applied on products coming in from certain countries where the EU had concluded that the state or the country was subsidizing these products, and as such providing an unfair disadvantage against EU traders selling and manufacturing the same type of products. As I say, country-specific trade defence measures. We have country-specific trade defence measures in place at the moment against Russian products due to the Ukraine war. We also know what's happening at the moment around Iran and elsewhere, other country-specific trade defence measures. And that means that those goods, when they come in from either GB or from the rest of the world, even if you are only selling them within the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, you cannot declare them under NIREM, Northern Ireland Remain, and your UKIMS authorisation. They must be declared as at risk. You can either then waive the associated duties, or if you pay the duty, you will be able, by presenting evidence, to claim that duty back thereafter using the duty reimbursement scheme. And on top of that, for direct rest of world imports into Northern Ireland, these are goods that are coming directly in, not via GB, coming directly from, for example, the US or China or wherever outside of the EU and Great Britain, the United Kingdom, into Northern Ireland, where the UK, where there's a 3% rule applies. So where the EU common external tariff is equal to or more than 3 points higher than the UK global tariff, that triggers automatically at risk status. For example, if the UK have a 2% tariff on an item, but the EU applies a 5% or 5.2% tariff on those goods, even if you are registered for UKIMS and meet all eligibility criteria, those goods will be deemed automatically at risk. The higher 5% or 5.2% tariff will apply. You can waive the difference between the two. So you can waive the 3%, 3.2% difference, or you can pay it and then claim it back through the duty reimbursement scheme by providing evidence. I've no doubt that this will come up later on. This is a good point to say plainly, because I've seen and I've read posts on LinkedIn and elsewhere around, you know, what tariff you can apply, the UK one or the EU one. There's no choice, and this is not an interpretation point. It's built into the framework, and in those cases where safeguarding tariffs apply, or where for rest of world to NI direct movements, the EU tariff is 3% or more higher than the UK tariff, that is the rate that will apply. So if goods are at risk, the next question, or next thing to say is do not panic. Because we're going to look at what levers exist to reduce or remove duty. Another thing to bear in mind is when you declare goods as not at risk of entering the EU, you are essentially closing off that market for those goods. You cannot sell into the EU goods that you've moved as being not at risk. So if you're declaring goods at risk or your goods are at risk, it's not the end of the world. So the next thing we're going to cover is what levers exist to reduce or remove duty. We move on to the next slide, please. I'm hoping to provide a bit of reassurance here. A lot of companies focus in on not at risk, at risk. A lot of companies focus in on trying to meet the criteria that their goods are not at risk. And then I've been told regularly that they get phone calls from companies in Ireland or elsewhere looking to buy off them, and they very, very reluctantly are having to turn down these opportunities to sell to them. And what I'm trying to say is, not at risk, UKIMS is great for internal UK trade, and it works well if your market is limited to Northern Ireland or the United Kingdom, and that is where you trade and you have no interest of working outside of those markets. The Windsor Framework was all about resolving issues around internal United Kingdom trade that presented themselves over time with the Northern Ireland Protocol. At risk does not automatically mean that EU duties must be paid. It means you need to look at what options are available and which options fit the movement for you. In this slide, you can see that there's 4 headline levers or 4 options open. But also remember that 30% of goods entering the EU from a third country, from outside the EU, including Great Britain, already have a 0% tariff on them. So that means that for 30%, just under 29%, I was looking at this yesterday when I was putting together my notes, I think it's about 29% of all commodity codes for products entering the EU have a 0% tariff. So when they come in, they're at risk, but there's a 0% tariff on it, and that's before we even look at any of these levers, so they will not have any duty applied. But if we're looking specifically here at the levers, we can use some of the following means. We've got UK preferential origin, return goods relief. I'm always hesitant about mentioning return goods relief, but it is an option and therefore it needs covered. And then we have the duty waiver or duty reimbursement schemes. And each option has specific eligibility criteria or evidence requirements attached to it. And we're going to go through these now, keeping it deliberately at a high level. Because the purpose here is to help you recognize what might apply in your model, but not to turn this webinar into a claims workshop. Okay, John, if you move on to the next one for me, please. So let's look first of all at UK preferential origin, because this is one that is often misunderstood. So I'm going to try and keep it simple. UK preferential origin applies under the UK-EU TCA, Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It can remove EU tariffs on at-risk goods where the goods meet UK origin rules under that EU-UK TCA. Crucially, this operates totally independently of UKIMS and non-at-risk status. Because it's made in the UK means it's a 0% tariff, but it doesn't mean the goods are not at risk. If there's a 0% tariff on the goods, the EU third country tariff, ergo omnes towards all tariff, most favoured nation tariff is 0%. No duty is applicable, but it doesn't mean the goods are not at risk. I know that previously we had been advised a number of years ago that if there's a 0% tariff to clear them under NIREM, but that has changed. We now declare it under either de minimis allowance or under none of the above apply tariff duty will be applicable, because 0% of something remains zero. What it depends on is straightforward in theory. UK preferences wholly obtained in the UK are sufficiently transformed under origin rules. That is the part that matters. Evidence is everything, and that is usually comes from your supplier or exporter led. This is a lever most businesses assume they have, but it's often where the first problems arise. Just because the commercial invoice says made in the UK, or where the origin states UK or GB, this doesn't mean that it meets UK preferential origin. First time I'm going to have to pause here and mute myself for a second. 1 second. I think I did well, 40 minutes without coughing, so apologies on that. Okay, so we often say it may say UK origin, but once it says UK origin, you need to check and see then, has it got a statement on the invoice? We, the undersigned, with the RIORI number, declare unless otherwise clearly indicated that these goods have been manufactured within the United Kingdom. If it doesn't have that, did they provide you with a certificate of origin or a statement of origin, which can cover multiple loads up to a period of 12 months. You need one or the other. They then clear under, in the case of a statement on invoice, U110 code. If it's a certificate of origin covering multiple loads, it's a U111 code. The other one is U112, which is importer's knowledge. This is where responsibility for providing evidence, if you have a review or compliance audit from customs and you're asked to provide evidence, that responsibility passes to you as the importer. Apologies again, I'm going to cough. Apologies. I scotted myself, I think. I would very rarely advise somebody to go down the route of saying of importer's knowledge, unless it is something that you're bringing in that you may have actually manufactured process that you sent to GB for some paint work or some additional finishing or whatever, or if you're moving in goods that belong to you and you know that they meet UK origin requirements, and then you use the U112 code. I also know that some fast parcel operators, and we're going to talk about this briefly when we talk about FPOs, they have, DHL for example, have added a importer's knowledge to declare UK preferential origin. I think this is to expedite the process. I don't have any direct communication on this specifically, but I believe it's expediting the process, because otherwise obviously they're having to check if there's a statement of origin on an invoice or if there is an accompanying certificate of origin. But the most common ways of declaring preferential origin is either via a statement on invoice or certificate of origin. Both wordings have been agreed under the UK-EU TCA. John, if we move on to the next one, please. So return goods relief. As I said, I was a bit hesitant in mentioning this one because it's one that throws up lots and lots of questions. But return goods relief in the Northern Ireland context is quite specific. This is about goods that were previously in free circulation in the European Union prior to moving to GB and then onward to NI. So the goods have moved from the European Union. It doesn't only apply to European Union origin goods. It also applies to any goods from outside the European Union that were cleared into free circulation in the EU. And then they move onward to Northern Ireland. Why is this important? The UK-EU TCA allows 0% tariffs and quota-free movement of goods of UK origin moving into the EU and the EU origin moving into the UK. It does not allow UK origin goods that have moved into the EU to move back into the UK at 0% tariff, or EU origin goods that have moved into the UK to move back into the EU at 0% tariff, unless they move under return goods relief and additional evidence requirements. That was a specific. It wasn't an oversight, in my opinion. CETA, the Canadian-European Agreement, allows some movement in both directions. I think it genuinely was a case that the EU didn't want a distribution hub off their coast in the form of the UK and vice versa. But return goods relief, specifically when we talk about the context of Northern Ireland, is goods that have entered GB that were in free circulation in the EU and then are coming back into Northern Ireland and de facto the European Union because we apply the rules. It's not general, we're returning something concept. It's specific about preserving that prior EU free circulation status. And as ever, evidence matters. The importer of record needs to be able to demonstrate that EU free circulation history. They need to be able to show that it has moved within a set time frame. I think it's 3 years standard. That the goods have not been modified within that time frame. The goods have not been modified other for storage reasons when in Great Britain. This crops up more often than people realise in GB distribution hub models and where EU source stock has moved around to meet demand. So it's an important one, but we really want to try and tie down with HMRC that return goods relief evidence requirement specific for Northern Ireland. We did have something in place, some of you will be aware of, a few years back, and I'm working hard with others to try and get that clarified going forward. But when neither preferential origin or return goods relief fits, that's when we move into scheme-based tools, and these are UK-specific scheme-based tools. Can you move into the next slide for me, please, John? Thank you. Duty waiver is for cases where UK preferential origin and return goods relief are not available. This is UK business specific. This was negotiated pre-Brexit in December 2020 by the then Brexit Minister for the UK, Michael Gove. It allows EU duty to be waived at the point of import into Northern Ireland. Waiving the duty means that the goods can then move into the European Union, into Ireland and elsewhere in the European Union. In order to be able to waive the duty, you must set up, the importer of record must set up via government gateway their duty waiver undertaking. And you then must, every 90 days, complete a report outlining any non-customs de minimis state aid that you received be that grants from InterTradeIreland, support from InterTradeIreland, or apprenticeship schemes or whatever else. Duty waiver scheme does not require evidence of the final destination of the goods. It does not require, which is required under UKIMS, it must be held for 5 years. It does not require a statement of origin on an invoice or on a certificate of origin for a period of 12 months, as is required for preference. It does not require evidence of the movement of the goods, as is required under return goods relief. The de minimis is the easiest option. Excuse me again. We have an allowance of €300,000. That is not the value of the goods, that's the value of the duty on the goods. So if you bring in goods at a value of 10,000 and the duty rate is 2%, it is 2% of 10,000. And that will come off your allowance. It's in euros, not sterling. It used to be the current financial year up until last March, February, March, April time last year. It applied to the current financial year and the previous 2 financial years. Sorry again, guys. It now applies to a rolling 36-month period, which is not as beneficial for us as the previous method of the current financial year and the 2 previous financial years was, because essentially when you got to April 6th in the year, the financial year in the UK, you went from 36 months, as in the current financial year and the previous 2 financial years, to essentially 24 months. And a lot of companies would plan movements of high duty products around that. So it's now 36-month rolling contract, a rolling period. So, but it is a very, very useful one. If we move on to the next slide, please, John. Time is not too bad either. I think we're working okay. Just the last thing on the duty waiver. Key message is be proactive. You need your duty waiver scheme undertaking set up via your government gateway account. You need to, there is a requirement to update your undertaking between the 15th of December and the 1st of January. If you hadn't updated it, you would have found that when you tried to apply a waiver, use NIAID on declarations last week or whatever, when you were clearing December declarations on TSS, you may not have been able to do so, and that was because of that. You must keep your report 90 days, even if you've not received anything of outside support, you still have to complete a null report every 90 days. Practical benefit is clearly cash flow. So if you don't have to pay the duty up front, you're not having to commit cash flow to it. And as I say, unlike other routes, it's not dependent on proven final destination or origin or trade flows. And this is one I believe separates businesses who plan from businesses who firefight. This is where you can look at the advantages that exist for you when trading with the EU. If you don't have a waiver in place, then you're in an after the event option. And that after the event option is the duty reimbursement scheme. So duty reimbursement is after the movement. EU duty has been paid on the import, and then you can reclaim it later when evidence requirements are met. And by the way, this is an option as well for those companies who might have been paying duty because they didn't realise that they could have used a waiver. You can go back now, even if you don't meet evidence requirements, i.e. that you sell on an all-Ireland basis, all Ireland or into the EU. You can go back now and say, I paid duty on X. I now want to offset this against my duty waiver instead, and you can be refunded that duty. So this is where the trader is retrospectively wanting to offset against their de minimis allowance via the customs waiver account or where they meet the evidence requirements and they can show that the goods remain within GB in the United Kingdom, or GB, Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. It's a reclaim mechanism, or it's an offset mechanism. Either way, it's retrospective. To me, it's a last resort, not because it doesn't work, but because it ties up cash and admin. You've been paying, you've paid out the funds and the cash out of your cash flow, and you're doing this afterwards. But it also is important on those automatically at risk movements where you cannot declare them as not at risk, and you may not have been given the option to use your waiver, and then you can claim it back at this point by offsetting it. Okay, if we move on to another one, I think we're okay on time, but this is going to be high level in any case. Thank you, John. So agri-food, this is where the Windsor Framework is most tangible for many businesses. This slide is about retail and internal NI supply chains under Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme, under NIREMS, or NIREMS. Agri-food moving GB to NI for final consumption in NI, in Northern Ireland. It covers retailers, wholesalers, caterers and public institutions. And the key idea is a simplification where goods are staying in Northern Ireland. If you ever want to see stress on the supply chain, watch the chilled food delivery with uncertainty attached. So Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme replaced STAMNI, which was the previous temporary scheme. And it provides the ability for retailers, wholesalers, caterers and public institutions such as schools, hospitals, care settings, etc. where they have signed up for the Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme to move goods under these simplifications. And this is where you see this not for EU labelling on products and so forth as well. And it's goods being sold in supermarkets in Newry, Strabane, Enniskillen and elsewhere today, and that they will be bought in groceries and they will head over the border then in the boot of somebody's car, but they have been sold within Northern Ireland. So what does this simplification look like in practice? So if you move on to the next slide for me, please, John. So in practice, single Northern Ireland Retail Movement Declaration replaces individual export health certificates for eligible goods. It's digital, remotely processed and reduced routine checks over time. So there's been a phased reduction, and there is a phased reduction in the checks. This is, by the way, because we don't have, at the time of recording, an SPS agreement between the UK and the EU. Practical impact is that GB-sourced agri-food can continue to be supplied to Northern Ireland consumers, including goods that would normally be prohibited and restricted goods, such as chilled meats. UK public health standards apply for NI end use, and it's continuity of Northern Ireland retail supply chains in line with those that are in GB. Apologies again. These facilitations are conditional. Destination and where the products are sold matters, and compliance matters. But I know from talking with and working with companies that are involved in distribution of agri-foods, and also with consultations with different bodies, trade bodies, that not all agri-food movements qualify for these simplified routes, and not all companies moving goods from GB to NI move goods under these simplified routes because they trade on an all-Ireland basis. So in that case, what happens? Again, John, if you move on to the next one for me, please. So, when full SPS controls apply, goods destined for the EU or at risk of onward movement to the EU, non-retail supply chains, mixed or non-compliant consignments, they must go down the red lane and meet the red lane requirements. And what does that mean? It means a full EU SPS regime, sanitary phytosanitary regime. Export health certificates were applicable, including some self-certs, EU CHET documentation requirements, identity and physical checks. It means that the same rules apply for GB NI movements that would apply for GB EU movements or rest of world EU movements. Retail staying in NI is facilitated. EU facing trade must meet EU rules. Key message to hold in your head. If you're moving in goods that are going to be sold into the EU, or you trade on an all-island basis, EU rules apply. That's not a Windsor Framework problem. That's the realities of Brexit. Apologies, folks. I'm coughing a bit more now, so I really did scud myself. If you move on to the next one, John, please. Key message is that retail movements staying in Northern Ireland benefit from simplifications under the Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme and UKIMS, UK Internal Market Scheme. EU facing agri-food trade must meet EU rules. Red lane controls protect the integrity of the EU single market. And it's a good slide to pause on briefly because it prevents you thinking there's one rule for all agri-food. If we think that customs complexity is tough, there's one thing worse, and believe me, it's SPS complexity. And it's for that reason that I take on very, very little work in that area. It is a complex area, and I genuinely hope that we see movement with this reset for the UK and EU, and that we can get an SPS agreement in the future, not only for GB-NI trade, but GB-IE trade and trade between GB and the EU in both directions. Okay, I'm conscious of time, John, but I've got a couple more slides to move through. Apologies again. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, we're going to look briefly at parcels, because parcels and freight have not been treated the same since the very beginning. Apologies, folks. I'm trying to not cough online or when I'm talking or anything like that. So my apologies for those brief moments where I pause and stop. So this slide covers parcels carve out. So how do we say, first of all, from the 1st of September or 1st of January 2021, we've had rules on freight movements, and they came into play right at the beginning. There was a bilateral grace period for parcels. That was then extended into a unilateral grace period for parcels, which then was finally dealt with under the Windsor Framework in February 2023, and rules were put in place. And it essentially means that we had a time where the size of the goods, so if you had a pallet load of bubble wrap at 30 or 40 pounds of value, and if you had a parcel with 200 pounds of IT hardware in it, the bubble wrap needed customs cleared, whilst the IT hardware parcel didn't. So separate regimes were put in place for freight movements and parcel movements. In May 2025, new arrangements for fast parcel operators were brought in. Our fast parcel movements were brought in line with the introduction of the internal market movement lane, the green lane, and the red lane under UKIMS. For the most part, I know of one company that I think uses TSS, but in the most part, fast parcel operators are clearing the consignments on the importer's behalf, be that as at risk or not at risk. Key caution here is Business parcels are not automatically not at risk. Even if you're UKIMS authorised, you must tell your parcel operator. You must notify them, instruct them that that's the case. Similar to freight movements, there should be, I'm not going to say there is, because I've campaigned hard on this. There should be similar facilitations in place, levers that you can use with parcels if they're at risk, such as declaring preferential origin under the UK EU TCA, use of return goods relief, and use of waivers. There has been some movement in this, but I believe there's a lot needs to be still done by fast parcel operators. Don't assume that parcels are simpler and they're therefore exempt. They may be simpler because the fast parcel operator is clearing them for you, but check and make sure you're not getting hit with very high disbursement fees, or where they're getting the duty rates attached to commodity codes and so forth, or even if they've got the information that they actually should have because they can't move it without it. Okay, the next slide, please, John. Consumer to consumer parcels. So me getting a parcel from a friend in GB, me getting a parcel from a e-commerce company in GB, me returning or something coming back from a consumer to a business here in Northern Ireland. These are essentially waiver, total waiver on these. And that is because the UK, Northern Ireland is part of the EU. Northern Ireland is part of the UK internal market. We have access to the EU single market for goods, but no customs declarations will apply for private individuals. We also have the unique scenario where Northern Ireland residents can receive parcels from both GB and the EU without any duty or tariffs being applied. This is going to become even more important and significant as the UK and the EU remove their de minimis waivers and the low value duty waiver and things like that on parcels over the next coming years. They're out in consultations at the moment. The EU have this new £2 charge to be introduced, and the UK are run until July 2029, have got a consultation now until April, and then possibly bringing it in around 2029. Northern Ireland consumers should continue to be able to benefit from none of this applying for parcels coming in from GB and the EU. No routine customs burden for consumers, and it shows that the Windsor Framework is about business and commercial movements. It's not C2C. The C2C element is not a workaround for commercial freight either. I've had companies mention in the past about being able to send parcels places to US, whatever, and not having to worry about customs. That's because they were sending it as consumer parcels, not as business parcels. It's not a workaround. I also have had cases where companies in Ireland have told me that they've sent parcels up, or they've gone to Newry and posted them from Newry out to customers in GB, and they didn't have to worry about customs. That's circumvention. It's not a workaround. The rules are there purely for consumer parcels, and that's why it is a requirement to stipulate if it's consumer or commercial. Okay, move on to the next one, please, John. So Northern Ireland trade with the rest of the world. There's been a lot discussed in this, and I'm very conscious of that, and I'm trying to keep it at a high level. But the point here is simply that external trade policy shifts can impact costs and impact businesses in Northern Ireland, on the island of Ireland, and especially where goods are moving into and out of Northern Ireland from locations like the US, and even that is when GB supply chains come into play. So this is a signposting slide, and if it's relevant to you and your business, it's one that I think you should go and speak to InterTrade Ireland for follow-up support rather than we're going to deep dive into it today. But last Easter, around April time last year, and obviously, we had again announcements in the last couple of days from the US in regards to tariffs and the application of tariffs on different countries. Northern Ireland's unique position here, if we go on to the next slide, John, is that in terms of goods moving into Northern Ireland from the US and other rest of the world, if the goods are deemed to be at risk of entering the EU tariffs apply. If, for example, the EU decided to apply safeguarding tariffs on the US, given an example, because of any issues with trade between the two, those goods would be automatically deemed at risk when entering Northern Ireland, be that US origin goods coming directly or US origin goods coming via GB. And those tariffs would apply to Northern Ireland. On the flip side, goods manufactured in Northern Ireland are deemed to be United Kingdom origin and will benefit from United Kingdom free trade agreements when being exported to countries like the US. But they must meet both non-preferential origin and preferential origin requirements. Non-preferential origin is sometimes harder to meet than preferential origin requirements. Preferential origin can often be around value add in itself. But non-preferential origin, it has to have had substantial transformation take place within Northern Ireland. This applies often, I speak with a lot of companies around whiskey, for example, and wondering if their product would be deemed as UK origin or EU Irish origin. And that we need to look at that substantial transformation rule and requirement. If you move on to the next one, please, for me. ICS2 has come up a lot in the last couple of weeks, and especially since the 1st of January, because we had, albeit that it came in September, there was a derogation on GB&I trade, and for a number of member states were granted a derogation up until the 1st of January. ICS2 is the EU safety and security system for goods entering the EU customs territory. It replaces the entry summary declaration process in practical terms, ICS1, but ENS is still the declaration mechanism used to deliver ICS2 requirements. What does this really mean? But what's the key clarification in this? One, ICS2 is not a customs declaration. I've had clients of mine being asked to sign indirect customs or direct representative customs representative forms on the back of ICS2. ICS2 is not a customs declaration. It's a safety and security declaration. It does not determine duty or tariff treatment. It's about advanced risk analysis and supply chain security. Data must be submitted before goods arrive. Under the Windsor Framework, ICS2 applies to Northern Ireland for goods entering from GB and from the rest of the world. And that's why it is coming into play now. What does it mean? Within ICS1, it was a simplified process. There was a description of goods needed to be provided. That description should have been sufficient to allow a customs officer, a customs agent to physically identify the goods at the point of movement. That wasn't always the case. So if you had Fruit of the Loom polo shirts, boxes of 100 multi-sizes and colours, you were getting as a description clothes. You could have had parts of vehicles, but you're getting as a description car parts, as opposed to clutch, flywheel, whatever it was. So it didn't meet the requirements. Under ICS2, there's additional information requirements. But who is responsible and what actually changes in the data? If we move on to the next slide, please, John. So what is the new data requirements under ICS2? It's more detailed than before. Every item in a load declared has to be declared individually. So if you've got a full pallet, every item on that pallet must be declared individually. If you have a full load but it's multiple products, every item in the load must be declared individually. So groupage loads, each individual item that has been shipped from your supplier to you in NI or indeed into Ireland from GB must be itemised and declared individually. Same as I say with palletised consignments. You must provide commodity code, country of origin, and clear item level description. It must be available before arrival. And that's where most ICS failures are not about technology failures, they're data failures. Poor descriptions, missing HS codes or commodity codes, and inconsistent paperwork will hold things up. Who is responsible for the ICS2? Who's responsible for giving that information? It's the carrier, but you will find that you will have delays, you will have issues with your loads not getting through clearance if you or your supplier do not provide that information to your haulier, your carrier. So I stress how important it is to ensure that it is dealt with and that you are providing this information to keep your goods moving. Okay, John, I think that's us, and we're at the last slide. I know this has been intense. I apologise for going over. I know I've gone 15 minutes over. But my aim was more about giving some clarity and confidence. And we've left a bit of time for Q&A. So do, put your questions via John. And then I believe John will also highlight some ITI support at this point. So thank you for listening. Thanks for persevering and keeping with me. Apologies for my short intermittent coughs as we go along.
Great stuff. Jonathan, thanks very much for that detailed presentation on the Windsor Framework and the current situations around ICS2. Just for the next couple of seconds, I'm going to cover supports available by the Trade Hub within InterTradeIreland. So our Trade Hub supports businesses to engage in efficient and effective trade on an all-island basis. We have a dedicated digital service that provides up-to-date, relevant and free trade information on our knowledge-based hub and also through our live chat. We can provide tailored consultancy advice, customs, VAT, regulation and employment. This is fully funded through two levels of support. One, our level 1 support, which Christine is going to pop in the chat for any businesses that want to apply for any support following this webinar. And then if your query can't be resolved initially within that level 1 support, you can move to level 2 support, which is up to 3 days, available to the value of £2,000. What we'll do now is we'll go through the questions in the chat, and there's been plenty of them, Jonathan. So maybe if we can keep the answers pretty high level, and if anybody requires further support after that, we can refer them to you through the application process. The first one that came in was from Andrew, and he was just looking some clarification around the dual access. Are Northern Ireland goods, meaning goods specifically with Northern Ireland country of origins?
No, it is goods that are physically located in Northern Ireland at the point of sale, John. So if I have stockists in Ireland or elsewhere in the EU, and I hold this stock in Northern Ireland in my warehouse or my shop or whatever, or even a 3PL logistics partner in Northern Ireland, and then I make those goods available for sale into GB, those goods have unfettered access and they would meet the qualified Northern Ireland goods status. And qualified Northern Ireland goods status is very much about trade between Northern Ireland and GB. And this qualified Northern Ireland goods definition was a requirement in addition asked of the UK government to prevent circumvention. The scenario where they wouldn't be considered as qualified Northern Ireland goods is if I, for example, am a drop shipper and I'm in Northern Ireland and I sell goods via my website or whatever, and those goods, I don't purchase those goods until an order comes in. Those goods wouldn't meet qualified Northern Ireland goods status in the sense that they weren't physically located in Northern Ireland at the point of sale. So if they moved after the point of sale, they would meet the status. But no, they don't have to be Northern Ireland origin. That would be preference. That would apply to, that's under UK UTCA. It's about physically in free circulation, not under any special customs procedure in Northern Ireland at the point of sale.
Great stuff, Jonathan. Thanks. Ryan has asked, would it be possible for a copy of the presentation after the seminar? Yes, Ryan, we will share a copy of the slides and a recording of today's webinar. Declan is asking, where goods are evidenced not at risk but are subject to trade remedy, they will still attract EU duty, requiring evidence to be provided for reimbursement. This adds additional costs on NI businesses and creates a disadvantage when compared with EU movements. I think where he's coming from there is around sanctions and through UKIMS. So if there's a sanction on the commodity codes or a sanction on anything that they don't automatically qualify for UKIMS, they'll be automatically at risk. Can you just elaborate on that maybe a little bit more?
Yeah, it is the case. We didn't write the rules, John. Anything that has safeguarding tariffs attached are automatically at risk. So if you're bringing in goods into the EU that were, because tariff rate quotas or anti-dumping duty or whatever, you can't declare them under UKIMS. You can waive the duty, or you can pay the duty and then claim it back through the duty reimbursement scheme. But the same rules would apply if somebody else is bringing those goods into Ireland, for example, or elsewhere in the EU. The difference being that they would not be able to claim back any of the duty attached to it. So I don't see any disadvantage in terms of, for Northern Ireland company against an EU company. If the goods have these safeguarding tariffs attached, they apply to non-EU origin goods. So if you're buying the same goods from somebody in the EU, they've already had these applied when they imported them into the EU, and therefore those costs which were not reclaimable will be, they will have had to allow for that in their final cost of their product. So you're getting hit with that cost anyway.
No bother. Russell acts as a third-party installer of retail displays and stands throughout the island of Ireland. At no stage does he take title of the goods, nor are they for sale ultimately, just for installation. Are they okay to bring these into Northern Ireland, carry them into the Republic for installation with no processing, tariffs, proof of at-risk? Is this simpler than the client sending directly to ROI?
In that scenario, somebody has to account for the customs. So if he doesn't own the goods, he should never be declaring himself as the importer of record. He is the consignee. The importer will be whoever owns the goods. The importer is responsible, therefore, for customs clearing the goods. He, as the consignee, will receive the goods, be that if he gets them sent to him in Northern Ireland and brings them then physically down into to the south, into Ireland, or if he gets them sent directly to a job in Ireland. In both cases, in a commercial invoice, in terms of customs, he is a consignee with no customs responsibilities. The importer is responsible, but somebody has to be clearing them.
Okay, perfect. Mark imports goods from the EU. They're buying them through a GB company, and they are shipped directly from the EU. If they've been UKIMS registered and are declaring the goods as not at risk, What process do they need to follow to remove UKIMS and start declaring all at risk?
If they're coming directly from the EU into Northern Ireland, there is no customs on it, John. So obviously you need to look at the trade flows and how it's actually moving. But customs applies to the physical movement of goods. So if goods are moving from an EU state into Northern Ireland directly, or if they're moving via GB under transit, there is no customs on it. So UKIMS won't come into play.
Sorry, John. He's buying them through a GB company and they're shipped directly from the EU to him.
Aye, so if they're coming directly from the EU, even though he's buying them from a GB company, if they're coming directly from the EU, there's no customs declaration. There's no customs declaration unless there's a physical movement. So if the company in GB is completing a customs declaration on those goods, they have no reason to be. If the goods are coming, it's actually, I would have customers where they would have goods that are EU origin that were moving via GB into Northern Ireland, and now they're buying them still from the GB supplier, but the goods are coming directly from the EU to them, because that cuts out the requirement to complete customs declarations. If he's completing customs declaration, there's no need. The CDS system and Trader Support Service, if I put in a customs declaration today, if I started customs declaration today for movement from GB to NI and state that it's going to move on a sailing tonight, tomorrow UKIM or TSS will tell me that I have a subdeck to complete, even if there's no physical goods have moved, John, because there's nothing ticking them off when they go into the port.
Perfect.
So if they are completing they should not be completing customs declarations for goods that are moving from one EU member state to Northern Ireland without going via GB, because there is no customs on it. That's the whole point of the Windsor Framework. We've got continued access to the EU single market for goods.
Brilliant. So Faye has stated that an exporter's 12 months declaration of UK preferential origin in lieu of an invoice declaration on each commercial invoice is not the same as a UK certificate of origin. UK country of origins issued by chambers of commerce evidence non-preferential origin and are not relevant for the purpose under the UK EU TCA. Just if you can provide some clarity on that.
Lovely to be taught. I know that they're different. I know what a preferential origin statement is. As a 12-month certificate of origin meets EU, UK, TCA requirements for multiple loads. And if you have, the other one is the statement of origin. And it is, the wording is as I stated, as agreed under the UK EU TCA. But if they meet the requirements, that the importer is responsible for ensuring that they have the right evidence requirements to claim preferential origin. But a UK preferential origin statement is issued by the Chambers of Commerce. Equally, the US do not accept, for example, a UK preferential origin statement from the Chamber of Commerce as evidence that it meets UK preferential origin requirements. But there is specific wording for the statement of origin covering a multiple up to a 12-month period. And there is the exact wording that is agreed, i.e. that we, the undersigned, declare with their EORI number at the point of import on
Lovely.
the invoice.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Keelan has brought up about returns good relief, which you covered in your presentation. Do I have to be the original importer and export from the EU, then on to NI again at a later date to claim return goods relief? And I'll maybe elaborate on that. So from an FMCG point of view, say a wholesaler, food wholesaler, buying products from a large manufacturer, if they remained under DDP terms with the large manufacturer, the manufacturer would be eligible for returns good relief. If you operated under Incoterms of DAP, can you still claim the return goods relief?
Yeah, this is a hard one, John, and it's one that I said that I was hesitant in talking about with but it needed to be included because it is one that is extremely important, especially for those reasons that you've just highlighted. There was specific wording agreed and a simplification for goods moving from GB to NI that were previously in free circulation in the EU prior to movement to GB and onward to NI. And this was communicated a couple of years ago. I have had multiple conversations, and the wording is still there when you go into the specific guidance on UK Gov. The short answer, well, there is no short answers, but the short answer is that you do not have to be, in theory, you do not have to be the exporter and the importer. That you must have evidence requirements. I appreciate fully that, you know, getting movement reference numbers and details of movements from EU into GB from a third party is extremely difficult because of commercial sensitivities and so forth. But there is the ability for an importer who is different from the exporter to claim return goods relief, and my advice would be to advise or to deal directly with HMRC, engage with the Northern Ireland Stakeholder Engagement Team, for example, in HMRC, and seek, you know, kind of guidance from them on what wording needs to be used to, you know, but it is a statement from your supplier. And I know in one case recently, if the supplier can provide evidence to back up that statement to HMRC, if ever requested at a later point, that was sufficient to claim return goods relief.
Outstanding. Thanks very much. We just have a couple more, so we'll carry on with them just to run over a couple of minutes. But Una has asked, how long approximately does it take HMRC to refund via the duty reimbursement scheme? Depending on the timing of the import, is having a duty deferment account an alternative for cash flow?
I believe that I want to say 16 days for a successful claim, but don't quote me on that, John. But I believe that it was around that too, that there was a commitment made by HMRC last year that a successful claim would be reimbursed within 16 days. The caveat in that is how you get to that successful claim bit. So evidence requirements, you know, in terms of evidence, to meet that evidence requirement under duty reimbursement scheme, there's no simple answer. If you only physically sell in a store, or if you sell online and you only sell to BT postcodes, and you have invoices, you know, and full paper chains of everything, you know, showing from purchase to sale, that should meet those criteria requirements, and you should move to a successful claim very quickly. If you want to offset it against your waiver, if you've paid the waiver and want to get the money reimbursed and have it against your duty waiver scheme instead, there's no evidence requirements in that case. It could have been sold into EU, so that should be a successful claim. But if it is parts that you bring in that are QR or SKU code or barcode identified, you know, such as processors or chips and things like that, that should be a pretty easy claim. It's down to you being able to provide full trade flow evidence and identification. For other things, it may be practically impossible. But once you get to that successful claim element, I think it's around the 2 weeks mark that they committed to. But I would be talking for HMRC on that one, John, so I couldn't do that.
Okay, perfect. And then Annette purchases packaging from a supplier in mainland GB. The packaging is dispatched via two means: one, by pallet through a logistics provider, and two, probably smaller orders through DHL fast parcel operator. When the goods are dispatched by the logistics through the pallets, they receive no customs duty charges, but when they come through DHL, they are receiving a customs duty charge. She's asking, why is this? And then can they claim that additional customs charge back?
Okay, so two things. I don't know who's actually clearing the goods in that scenario. If the supplier is also the importer, if the supplier is acting as the importer of record, which they can do, and then they would be the consignee as that third party scenario earlier on, they could be declaring the goods under UK preferential origin by those means necessary, or using importer's knowledge, or they could be waiving it. If they are clearing the goods themselves, they could be clearing them over under UK preferential origin, or they could be waiving it. In the case of the fast parcel operator, the fast parcel operator is clearing the goods on their behalf. The fast parcel operator is just applying the duty and then a disbursement fee. The disbursement fee is their charge, administration charge for taking care of the duty element. You can ask them if it meets UKIMS, if it meets preferential origin. You can instruct them that these goods meet UK preferential origin, and therefore you want to declare them under UK preferential origin. Or you can say, we want to waive this duty, and using your de minimis allowance, and you can give them your EORI number. So that's, but you can only, if you want to claim it back, you can only claim back the duty. You cannot claim back the disbursement fee. So that's the problem. You could have £4 duty and £16 of disbursement fees. And this is one that I've been talking about regularly on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And this is one where DHL, to be fair, are one of the first ones to have acted in the ability to allow companies to use de minimis allowance. I know they've got this importer's knowledge option where you sign off that it meets preferential origin requirements. Thereafter, if you are asked by HMRC to present evidence, that evidence may be that you have the statement of origin under on the invoice, or a multi-load consigned statement of origin covering that 12-month period.
Perfect.
And by the way, just on that, I would be extremely surprised as well if the HMRC didn't accept a UK preferential origin statement as well. I haven't yet had a case where I've seen it turned down, because it's the UK government that will be, and it's HMRC that will ultimately be looking at compliance review. But there is specific wording under the EU-UK TCA for preferential origin.
Perfect. I'm just conscious that we've ran over a bit on, so any of the questions we haven't got to in the chat, we'll take them away and we'll get a reply for you from Jonathan. Or if you feel that you want to apply through the level 1 support, which Christine has put the link into the chat, please do so. All of those questions will be fielded to Jonathan directly for a reply. At this time, I'd just like to bring people's attention to our technical trade forum. This is a forum that gathers feedback from businesses on barriers to cross-border trade on the island of Ireland. We feed this directly into the Northern Ireland Department and the departments down south. If you would like to be part of this, the links to the relevant sectors are being put into the chat at the minute. They will also be attached to the email that will follow in the next couple of days with this. So we'll send a copy of the recording, we'll send a copy of the slides and the links to the technical trade forum, and also the level 1 support for any SMEs that require further help. At this time, I'd like to just say our next trade series is scheduled for the 10th of February, and it will be on navigating hybrid working in a cross-border element. Again, thanks to Jonathan for his time today, for answering the questions and the presentation, and everybody for their attendance. Look forward to seeing everybody again on our next webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you.